2 a.m. Welcome back to the 2 a.m. Book Review Club, where we stay up late talking about books or talk about books that made us stay up late. It's October, the spookiest time of the year, and arguably the most iconic Halloween image is that of a haunted house. As a society, we have a collective and long-standing fascination with haunted houses. There are haunted house attractions, haunted house movies, and of course, haunted house books. But what do we talk about when we talk about haunted houses? Or more specifically, what do we talk about when we talk about haunted house stories? There are three main things that we tend to talk about when we talk about haunted house stories. Number one, when we talk about haunted houses, we tend to talk about isolation, either physical or psychological, because once you're in the grip of a haunted house, you're isolated, you're trapped, you can't get out. Number two, when we talk about haunted houses, we tend to talk about dark pasts, because part of the appeal of the genre is the mystery that surrounds the house. Why is it haunted? What secrets is it hiding? What's the conclusive reason that this house is not like the other houses? And finally, number three, when we talk about haunted houses, we tend to talk about power. Most haunted houses are big and glamorous and once belonged to the rich and powerful, because, let's face it, nobody's interested in reading about a shack in the middle of the woods. No, we're drawn to the wealth and power that the house represents. And we are also drawn to the downfall of that wealth and power. We're drawn to the idea that great power necessarily comes with great suffering. We revel in the schadenfreude that these fancy people living in their fancy house have been brought low. We glory in the dirty, shameful secrets that haunt this house. And yet, at the same time, we love to be terrified by the power that this house, even in its current condition, still represents. And those are the haunted house themes we'll be talking about today as we discuss two of the greatest haunted house stories of all time. The Haunting of Hill House, first published in 1959, and We Have Always Lived in the Castle, first published in 1962. Today, we are holding the great Shirley Jackson debate. The debate where we decide once and for all which one is the best haunted house book. And in this debate, we'll have 3 rounds. 1 round for each haunted house theme, as well as a surprise bonus round I'll reveal at the end. And the book with the most points will be crowned the definitive haunted house book. So let's do it. Let's kick off the great Shirley Jackson debate. The Haunting of Hill House versus We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And may the best haunted house book win. Part 1, the debate. Round 1, isolation. The Haunting of Hill House opens with an anthropology professor named Dr. Dr. Montague, thinking to himself, hey, you know what would be a really fun summer vacation? Staying in a famously haunted house with a group of complete strangers. Dr. Montague has decided to spend 3 months at the infamously haunted Hill House with a group of 3 volunteers. We have Theodora, who is a psychic artist. We have Luke, who is described as a liar and a thief, and who is only invited because he is part of the family who owns Hill House. And then finally, we have our protagonist, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor is 32 years old. She spent 11 years caring for her now deceased mother, and she is more than ready to finally live her own life. So when she gets the invitation to spend 3 months at Hill House, she does the horror movie thing where she's like, why not? What could possibly go wrong? And if this were an ordinary haunted house story, this would be a decision that Eleanor would come to regret. I mean, the book says it best. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Hill House is not sane, and the things that happen in Hill House are equally not sane. There are unseen forces that try to break into your room in the middle of the night. The iron crash came against their door, and both of them lifted their eyes in horror because the hammering was against their door, because the hammering was against the upper edge of the door, higher than either of them could reach, higher than Luke or the doctor could reach, and the sickening, degrading cold came in waves from whatever was outside the door. There is spooky writing that appears on the walls. The writing was large and straggling, and ought to have looked, Eleanor thought, as though it had been scribbled by bad boys on a fence. Instead, it was incredibly real, going in broken lines over the thick paneling of the hallway. From one end of the hallway to the other, the letters went, almost too large to read, even when she stood back against the opposite wall. "Can you read it?" Luke asked, softly, and the doctor, moving his flashlight, read slowly, "Help, Eleanor, come home." And of course, there are also terrifying hallucinations. The path led them to its destined end and died beneath their feet. Eleanor and Theodora looked into a garden, their eyes blinded with the light of sun and rich color. Incredibly, there was a picnic party on the grass in the garden. They could hear the laughter of the children and the affectionate, amused voices of the mother and father. The grass was richly, thickly green. The flowers were colored red and orange and yellow. The sky was blue and gold, and one child wore a scarlet jumper and raised its voice again in laughter, tumbling after a puppy over the grass. There was a checked tablecloth spread out and smiling. The mother leaned over to take up a plate of bright fruit. Then Theodora screamed. "Don't look back!" she cried out in a voice high with fear. "Don't look back! Don't look! Run!" Running, without knowing why she ran, Eleanor thought that she would catch her foot on the checked tablecloth. She was afraid she might stumble over the puppy. But as they ran across the garden, there was nothing except weeds growing blackly in the darkness. In any other haunted house story, Eleanor would be trying to find a way out of this situation, and the house would be fighting back, and Eleanor would do stupid things while screaming loudly, and it would be very, very frustrating to read about for 272 pages. But this is not that kind of story, and Eleanor is not that kind of protagonist. For example, consider how she handles Hill House's isolation, both physical and psychological. Number one, Hill House is physically isolated. It takes Eleanor the first 28 pages of the book to get to Hill House. And when she finally does reach it, it looks more like a prison than a house. The gate was tall and ominous and heavy, set strongly into a stone wall which went through the trees. Even from the car, she could see the padlock and the chain that was twisted around and through the bars. Beyond the gate, she could see only that the road continued, turned, shadowed on either side by the still, dark trees. And number two, Hill House is psychologically isolating, as we can see in this conversation between our four ghost hunters: Eleanor, Dr. Montague, Theodora, and Luke. Is there still a world somewhere? Eleanor asked wonderingly. Mrs. Dudley, the housekeeper, had made them a peach shortcake, and she looked down at her plate and said, I am sure that Mrs. Dudley goes somewhere else at night, and she brings back heavy cream each morning, and Dudley comes up with groceries every afternoon. But as far as I can remember, there is no other place than this. We are on a desert island, Luke said. I can't picture any world but Hill House, Eleanor said. Perhaps, Theodora said, we should make notches on a stick, or pile pebbles in a heap, one each day, so we will know how long we have been marooned. Hill House is mentally and physically absorbing this group of people into its terrifying world. But instead of being scared, they seem complacent, even grateful. And Eleanor in particular is not just grateful, she is happier than she has ever been. Looking at herself in the mirror, with the bright morning sunlight freshening even the blue room of Hill House. And I am unbelievably happy. You are happy, Eleanor. You have finally been given a part of your measure of happiness. It doesn't matter what jump scares Hill House throws at her. It doesn't matter that she might never go home. It doesn't matter that the outside world might as well not exist, because it's only here, trapped physically and psychologically in a terrifying haunted house, that Eleanor has finally managed to escape her unhappy life and make friends. Now let's meet the protagonist of the other book we're talking about today. We have always lived in the castle. My name is Mary Catherine Blackwood. I am 18 years old, and I live with my sister Constance. I have often thought that, with any luck at all, I could have been born a werewolf, because the two middle fingers on both my hands are the same length. But I have had to be content with what I had. I dislike washing myself, and dogs, and noise. I like my sister Constance, and Richard Plantagenet, and Amanita Philides, the death cap mushroom. Everyone else in my family is dead. Mary Catherine, usually referred to by her nickname Maricat, lives with her sister Constance and their uncle Julian in the ancestral Blackwood home, which, like Hill House, is closed off to the outside world. I had to put down the shopping bag to open the lock on the gate. It was a simple padlock, and any child could have broken it. But on the gate was a sign saying, "Private, no trespassing," and no one could get past that. Our father had put up the signs, and the gates, and the locks when he closed off the path, Before, everyone used the path as a shortcut from the village to the highway four corners where the bus stopped. It saved them perhaps a quarter of a mile to use our path and walk past our front door. Our mother disliked the sight of anyone who wanted to walk past our front door. And when our father brought her to live in the Blackwood house, one of the first things he had to do was close off the path and fence in the entire Blackwood property from the highway to the creek. There was another gate at the other end of the path, although I rarely went that way, and that gate too had a padlock and a sign saying, "Private. No trespassing. The highway's built for common people," our mother said, "and my front door is private." Unlike Hill House, the Blackwood home is not physically isolated from the rest of the world, but psychologically, both Maricat and Constance have inherited their mother's disdain for so-called common people, i.e. the villagers who do not live in gated-off mansions that they inherited from their wealthy families. All of the village was of a piece, a time, and a style. It was as though the people needed the ugliness of the village and fed on it. The houses and the stores seemed to have been set up in contemptuous haste to provide shelter for the drab and the unpleasant. And the Rochester house, and the Blackwood house, and even the town hall had been brought here, perhaps accidentally, from some far, lovely country where people lived with grace. Perhaps the fine houses had been captured, perhaps as punishment for the Rochesters and the Blackwoods and their secret bad hearts, and were held prisoner in the village. Perhaps their slow rot was a sign of the ugliness of the villagers. The row of stores along Main Street was unchangingly gray. The people who owned the stores lived above them in a row of second-story apartments, and the curtains in the regular line of second story were pale and without life. Whatever planned to be colorful lost its heart quickly in the village. The blight on the village never came from the Blackwoods. The villagers belonged here, and the village was the only proper place for them. At one point in the book, Maricat says, "The people of the village have always hated us." And it's like, no, really? I wonder why. The village is a place that the sisters interact with only out of necessity. Fridays and Tuesdays were terrible days because I had to go into the village. Someone had to go to the library and the grocery. Constance never went past her own garden, and Uncle Julian could not. Therefore, it was not pride that took me into the village twice a week, or even stubbornness, but only the simple need for books and food. And in this psychological isolation, Maricat and Constance have formed an intense sisterly bond where Constance infantilizes her 18-year-old sister and Maricat, well, worships Constance. When I was small, I thought Constance was a fairy princess. I used to try to draw her picture with long golden hair and eyes as blue as the crayon can make them, and a bright pink spot on either cheek. The pictures always surprised me because she did look like that. Even at the worst time, she was pink and white and golden, and nothing had ever seemed to dim the brightness of her. She was the most precious person in my world, always. And because Maricat is happy to be forever alone with her adored sister, she is shocked to discover that Constance might actually not be happy being isolated from the rest of the world forever. Constance had looked as though suddenly, after all this time of refusing and denying, she had come to see that it might be possible, after all, to go outside. I realized now that this was the third time in one day that the subject had been touched, and 3 times makes it real. I could not breathe. I was tied with wire, and my head was huge and going to explode. I ran to the back door and opened it to breathe. I wanted to run. If I could have run to the end of our land and back, it would have been all right. But Constance was alone with them in the drawing room, and I had to hurry back. I had to content myself with smashing the milk pitcher which waited on the table. It had been our mother's, and I left the pieces on the floor so Constance would see them. Constance seems to want to leave the house, to go to the village, and maybe even beyond. But Meerkat is going to do everything she can to make sure that nothing changes, that their isolation remains intact, and that Constance will forever be trapped with her at Blackwood House. And there we go. That's Haunted House theme number 1, isolation, and how that theme plays out in both books. So now we have to decide which book did it better. And I think the winner of round 1 has to be The Haunting of Hill House. I mean, just consider the psychological horror of that earlier conversation between the ghost hunters. How easily and quickly they find themselves being absorbed into such a terrifying place. And honestly, being isolated at Hill House is just a much scarier concept than being isolated at the Blackwood House. So, round 1 goes to The Haunting of Hill House, and now let's move on to round 2. Round 2, Dark Pasts. Now, if you've ever read We Have Always Lived in the Castle, you're probably wondering why I keep calling it a haunted house book. Because unlike Hill House, the Blackwood home is not in-your-face scary. Instead, it is constantly giving you the feeling that something is a little bit off. Something is not quite right. For example, consider this excerpt. On Saturday mornings, I helped Constance. I was not allowed to handle knives, but when she worked in the garden, I cared for her tools, keeping them bright and clean, and I carried great baskets of flowers, sometimes, or vegetables, which Constance picked to make into food. The entire cellar of our house was filled with food. All the Blackwood women had made food and had taken pride in adding to the great supply of food in our cellar. There were jars of jam made by great-grandmothers with labels in thin pale writing, almost unreadable by now, and pickles made by great-aunts, and vegetables put up by our grandmother. And even our mother had left behind her 6 jars of apple jelly. Constance had worked all her life at adding to the food in the cellar, and her rows and rows of jars were easily the handsomest and shone among the others. You bury food the way I bury treasure, I told her sometimes, and she answered me once, the food comes from the ground and can't be permitted to stay there and rot. Something has to be done with it. All the Blackwood women had taken the food that came from the ground and preserved it, and the deeply colored rows of jellies and pickles and bottled vegetables and fruit, maroon and amber and dark rich green, stood side by side in our cellar and would stand there forever, a poem by the Blackwood women. Each year, Constance and Uncle Julian and I had jam or preserve or pickle that Constance had made, but we never touched what belonged to the others. Constance said it would kill us if we ate it. In this excerpt, we are talking about jam, we are talking about jelly. Everything is very cozy. And then you're like, wait a minute, what was that about Maricat not being allowed to handle knives? And did Constance just say that eating the jam and the jelly would kill them? What is actually going on here? Well, what's going on here is that Blackwood House is haunted by the memory of a mass murder where every single person in the Blackwood family, except for Constance, Maricat, and Uncle Julian, was murdered. And keeping that revelation in mind, let's return for a moment to that passage I just quoted. We have a cellar completely filled with food, which conjures up an image of coziness, safety, domesticity. This food was made by generations of Blackwood women. There are jams made by great-grandmothers, pickles made by great-aunts, and jellies made by mothers. As Maricat so memorably describes it, the deeply colored rows of jellies and pickles and bottled vegetables and fruit, maroon and amber and dark rich green, stood side by side in our cellar and would stand there forever, a poem by the Blackwood women. And then suddenly we get a huge tonal shift. Each year, Constance and Uncle Julian and I had jam or preserve or pickle that Constance had made, but we never touched what belonged to the others. Constance said it would kill us if we ate it. This poem that has been created by generations of Blackwood women is beautiful to look at, but it's actually a deadly trap because the cellar is where the Blackwood women store the poisonous anger that they have been bottling up generation after generation. And eventually, that pent-up female rage manifested as an arsenic-laced bowl of sugar that killed almost everyone in the Blackwood family. Now, since Constance has always done the cooking, she was the prime suspect in the murder investigation. And although she was acquitted, you're still going to look a little bit suspicious as one of the sole survivors of a mass murder, no matter what a judge and jury said. The villagers still think that Constance is a murderer, and they are not going to let the sisters forget it. The local kids even make up chants to mock Constance and Maricat, which honestly doesn't seem like a smart move if you think Constance is a murderer. Maricat, said Connie, would you like a cup of tea? Oh no, said Maricat, you'll poison me. Maricat, said Connie, would you like to sleep? Down in the boneyard, 10 feet deep. Creative. But even at home, Maricat and Constance cannot escape the memories because their Uncle Julian, the only other survivor, is mentally stuck reliving the worst day of his life over and over again. It was a fine morning, Uncle Julian said, his voice going on and on. A fine, bright morning, and none of them knew it was their last. She was downstairs first, my niece Constance. I woke up and heard her moving in the kitchen. I slept upstairs then. I could still go upstairs, and I slept with my wife in our room. And I thought, this is a fine morning, never dreaming then that it was their last. Then I heard my nephew. No, it was my brother. My brother came downstairs first after Constance. I heard him whistling. Constance? Yes. What was that tune my brother used to whistle, and always off key? Constance thought, her hands in the ground, and hummed softly, and I shivered. The Blackwoods are gone, but Constance and Merricat will forever be haunted by the memory of how they died. In the haunting of Hill House doesn't just have one dark secret. Its entire history is just a whole lot of drama and violence and chaos, all centered around the Crane family. The Crane family built Hill House. They lived there for generations, and they even fought over who would inherit Hill House, which I know sounds insane. But by the time Dr. Montague and his ghost hunters arrive, the Cranes are all dead, and the only proof the Cranes ever lived there is a handmade book made by Hugh Crane, the man who built Hill House. And this book was intended for his young daughter, Sophia. Memories for Sophia Ann Lester Crane, a legacy for her education and enlightenment during her lifetime from her affectionate and devoted father, Hugh Desmond Lester Crane, 21st June, 1881. Now, this dedication might sound sweet, but the actual book is full of terrifying, graphic religious imagery, and you will never guess what is on the final page of this absolutely insane book. The last page is the very nicest, I think. This, ladies, is Hugh Crane's blood. Now, do you want to see Hugh Crane's blood? No, thank you. Theo? No? In any case, I insist, for the sake of your two consciences, in reading what Hugh Crane has to say in closing his book. Daughter, secret pacts are signed in blood, and I have here taken from my own wrist the vital fluid with which I bind you. Live virtuously. Be meek. Have faith in thy Redeemer, and in me, thy Father. And I swear to thee that we will be joined together hereafter in unending bliss. Accept these precepts from thy devoted father, who in humbleness of spirit has made this book. May it serve its purpose well, my feeble effort, and preserve my child from the pitfalls of this world, and bring her safe to her father's arms in heaven. And signed, thy ever-loving Father, in this world and the next, author of thy being, and guardian of thy virtue, in meekest love, Hugh Crane. Theodora shuddered. How he must have enjoyed it, she said, signing his name in his own blood. I can see him laughing his head off. The implication here is that since the Cranes were miserable people who passed their misery down from generation to generation, it's no wonder Hill House is haunted. But the fundamental tension of this book is that we don't actually know if it's the people who are at fault or if it's the house itself. Dr. Montague, our expert on the history of Hill House, thinks that it's definitely the house. Essentially, he went on slowly, the evil is the house itself, I think. It has enchained and destroyed its people and their lives. It is a place of contained ill will. But even Dr. Montague admits that he doesn't really know. The concept of certain houses as unclean or forbidden, perhaps sacred, is as old as the mind of man. Certainly, there are spots which inevitably attach to themselves an atmosphere of holiness and goodness. It might not then be too fanciful to say that some houses are born bad. Hill House, whatever the cause, has been unfit for human habitation for upwards of 20 years. What it was like before then, whether its personality was molded by the people who lived there, or the things they did, or whether it was evil from the start, are all questions I cannot answer. Naturally, I hope that we will all know a good deal more about Hill House before we leave. No one knows, even, why some houses are called haunted. And I would like to emphasize again that last sentence. No one knows, even, why some houses are called haunted. Because it's not the jump scares or the paranormal activity that make a house haunted. The haunting comes from the memories that the house carries. The haunting comes from the actions of the people who inhabit the house. And maybe, just maybe, the haunting comes from the house itself. And there we go. That's Haunted House theme number 2, Dark Pasts, and how that theme plays out in both books. So now we have to decide which book did it better. And although I did struggle to pick a winner for this round, I think probably the winner of round 2 has to be The Haunting of Hill House. One of the themes I could have included in this debate, but didn't for the sake of time, is ambiguity, because there is nothing scarier than not actually knowing what's going on. Too often, at least in my opinion, a haunted house story is ruined by the author's compulsion to explain everything away. And I appreciate that in The Haunting of Hill House, part of the horror comes from the tension of that underlying question. Is it the cranes or is it the house? So, round 1 went to The Haunting of Hill House. Round 2 also goes to The Haunting of Hill House. And now, let's move on to round 3. Round 3, power. In We Have Always Lived in the Castle, there are a lot of complicated relationships with complicated power dynamics. For example, consider the relationship between the Blackwoods and the villagers. The Blackwoods, a wealthy landed family, look down on the villagers, and the villagers in turn react with hostility. As Maricat says, the people of the village have always hated us. But since the whole mass murder incident, the villagers feel that they have moral leverage over the surviving Blackwoods. The Blackwoods still have their money, and they still have their land, and they still have their fancy house, but their trademark moral superiority is a little difficult to maintain after a massacre. The villagers will never have the Blackwoods' real-world power, but the scandal has given them an easy way to mock and harass the Blackwoods. The Blackwoods are classist snobs. The villagers are vicious and cruel. And as a result, we have this very tense power dynamic that is full of rage and hatred and violence. Turning to the central relationship in this book, the Constance-Maricat relationship, we can see that despite Constance being the older sister, it's Maricat who holds the real power. Maricat throws violent tantrums if she doesn't get her way. She is trying to keep Constance isolated in the Blackwood home, and she refuses refuses to accept the reality where she is not the center of Constance's world. But then Cousin Charles shows up for a visit, and it is no longer just Merricat and Constance at Blackwood House. Merricat is not pleased by this visit and immediately tries to convince Constance that he is a ghost. "He was a ghost," I said. Constance laughed, and it was a sound very far away. "Then a ghost is sleeping in Father's bed," she said, "and ate a very hearty dinner last night." "While you were gone," she said. "I dreamed that he came. I fell asleep on the ground and dreamed that he came, but then I dreamed him away." I was held tight. When Constance believed me, I could breathe again. "We talked for a long time last night." "Go and look," I said, not breathing. "Go and look. He isn't there." "Silly Merricat," she said. In a way, Merricat is not wrong. The Blackwoods are dead. But now, suddenly, there is a new Blackwood, Charles, who revives the ghost of how life used to be at Blackwood House before the power dynamic shifted in Merricat's favor. Where Merricat is stubborn and opinionated, Constance is a pushover. She likes to take care of people and make them happy. And as symbolized by her old-fashioned obsession with keeping a perfect house, she is someone who actively helps to uphold the prevailing power structure. So when Cousin Charles arrives, Merricat is going to listen to whatever he says because he is a Blackwood and a man. Constance loves Merricat, yes, but Merricat is just her immature little sister. This is 1962, and Constance will uphold Cousin Charles's position as the new center of power in the Blackwood household. While Charles sat in the kitchen in the mornings, eating hugely of ham and potatoes and fried eggs and hot biscuits and donuts and toast, Uncle Julian drowsed in his room over his hot milk, and sometimes when he called to Constance, Charles said, "Tell him you're busy. You don't have to go running every time he wets the bed. He just likes being waited on." The hypocrisy here, mind-blowing. And because the only person who will challenge Charles's power is Merricat, Charles also attempts to exert control over Merricat via Constance. Constance asked, not looking up at me, "Where have you been, Merricat?" "Wandering. Where is my cat?" "I think," Constance said, "that we are going to have to forbid your wandering. It's time you quieted down a little." "Does we mean you and Charles?" "Merricat," Constance turned toward me, sitting back against her feet and folding her hands before her. "I never realized until lately how wrong I was to let you and Uncle Julian hide here with me. We should have faced the world and tried to live normal lives. Uncle Julian should have been in a hospital all these years with good care and nurses to watch him. We should have been living like other people. You should..." She stopped and waved her hands helplessly. "You should have boyfriends," she said finally, and then began to laugh because she sounded funny even to herself. But Merricat is not laughing because this reversal of power has made her angry, and there will be consequences, both for Cousin Charles and also for Constance. In one of the book's most memorable scenes, at the height of Cousin Charles's power over the Blackwood home and over Constance, Merricat gives us our only glimpse into life at the Blackwood house before the mass murder. I sat on the floor and placed all of them correctly in my mind. In the circle around the dining room table, our father sat at the head, our mother sat at the foot. Uncle Julian sat on one hand of our mother, and our brother Thomas on the other. Beside my father sat our Aunt Dorothy and Constance. I sat between Constance and Uncle Julian in my rightful, my own improper place at the table. Slowly, I began to listen to them talking. To buy a book for Mary Catherine. Lucy, should not Mary Catherine have a new book? Mary Catherine should have anything she wants, my dear. Our most loved daughter must have anything she likes. Constance, your sister lacks butter. Pass it to her at once, please. Mary Catherine, we love you. Our beloved, our dearest Mary Catherine must be guarded and cherished. Thomas, give your sister your dinner. She would like more to eat. Dorothy, Julian, rise when our beloved daughter rises. Bow all your heads to our adored Mary Catherine. Obviously, this is not a memory. This is a fantasy where Maricat is conjuring up the ghosts of her dead family and forcing them to say that she's special, that she's the best, that she is the most loved. This scene contains all of Maricat's anger and rage and violence, and it is a warning to Cousin Charles and to Constance that Maricat will bend or even break reality to reassert her power. In The Haunting of Hill House, the most obvious power dynamic is between the house and the ghost hunters, a dynamic where Hill House unleashes terrifying event after terrifying event to let its unwelcome guests know who's really in charge here. But, as Dr. Montague says, no physical danger exists, the doctor said, positively. No ghost in all the long histories of ghosts has ever hurt anyone physically. The only damage is done by the victim to himself. Hill House has the ability to scare the ghost hunters, but it doesn't actually have the power to hurt them. Unfortunately, Hill House is intelligent, and on the night a supernatural force tries to break into Eleanor's room, Luke and Dr. Montague are lured outside by the sound of a barking dog who isn't there. This obviously concerns the doctor, and he says, "We must take precautions," he said. "Against what? How? When Luke and I are called outside, and you two are kept imprisoned inside, doesn't it begin to seem," and his voice was very quiet, "doesn't it begin to seem that the intention is, somehow, to separate us?" But the real separation that Hill House is attempting is not physical, it's psychological. Which is why when we get the chalk writing on the wall, it doesn't say something generic like "get out" or "get lost." No, it says "help, Eleanor, come home," because Hill House is trying to divide the group. It's trying to change the power dynamic from Hill House versus ghost hunters to Eleanor versus the rest of the ghost hunters. And at first, Eleanor rejects this possibility. "I could say," Eleanor put in, smiling, "all three of you are in my imagination. None of this is real." "If I thought you could really believe that," the doctor said gravely, "I would turn you out of Hill House this morning. You would be venturing far too close to the state of mind which would welcome the perils of Hill House with a kind of sisterly embrace." "He means he would think you were batty, Nell dear." Well, Eleanor said, I expect I would be. If I had to take sides with Hill House against the rest of you, I would expect you to send me away. Why me, she wondered. Why me? Am I the public conscience, expected always to say, in cold words, what the rest of them are too arrogant to recognize? Am I supposed to be the weakest? Weaker than Theodora? Of all us, she thought, I am surely the one least likely to turn against the others. Eleanor says that she is the least likely to turn against the others, and that does follow a certain logic, because this is the first time in her life when she has been given the opportunity to form connections with other people. So then why has Hill House singled out Eleanor as the most vulnerable person in the group? And we can find the answer to that question in Eleanor's relationship with Theodora, arguably the most important relationship she forms at Hill House. Eleanor and Theodora are close in age. They are living in adjacent rooms. They're going through all of these horrific experiences together, and it's natural for them to quickly become friends. But because Eleanor has spent much of her adult life caring for a mother whom she hated and who hated her, this connection with Theodora develops not just into friendship, but an intense attachment that I can only describe as an obsessive love-hate relationship. Eleanor loves Theodora and obsesses over Theodora, but she also hates Theodora and fantasizes about physically harming her. I would like to hit her with a stick, Eleanor thought, looking down on Theodora's head beside her chair. I would like to batter her with rocks. And yet, at the end of the day, Eleanor can't imagine living without Theodora. But Theodora, unfortunately, doesn't feel the same way. Theodora smiled a little. You look so serious, she said. Are you coming to some great decision? Yes, Eleanor said, deciding. About what I'm going to do afterwards, after we all leave Hill House. Well, I'm coming with you, Eleanor said. Coming where with me? Back with you, back home. I, and Eleanor smiled wryly, am going to follow you home. Theodora stared. Why? She asked, blankly. I never had anyone to care about, Eleanor said, wondering where she had heard someone say something like this before. I want to be someplace where I belong. I am not in the habit of taking home stray cats, Theodora said, lightly. I'll come, you know, Eleanor said. I'll just come. I don't understand. Theodora threw down her pencil in exasperation. Do you always go where you're not wanted? Eleanor smiled placidly. I've never been wanted anywhere, she said. Eleanor continues to insist that she's going home with Theodora. Theodora keeps making it clear that Eleanor is not welcome to follow her home. And this evolution, or rather devolution, of Eleanor and Theodora's relationship mirrors the devolution of Eleanor's relationship with the rest of the group as a whole. Let's revisit that scene where Eleanor and the rest of the group discover the spooky writing on the wall containing Eleanor's name. Theodora suggests that Eleanor did the writing, and Eleanor gets upset, to say the least. Maybe it was only addressed to me because no possible appeal for help could get through that iron selfishness of yours. Maybe I might have more sympathy and understanding in 1 minute than... And maybe, of course, you wrote it yourself, Theodora said again. That's enough, Eleanor. Luke, said unbelievably, and Eleanor whirled around, stamping. How dare you, she said, gasping. How dare you? And the doctor laughed then, and she stared at him, and then at Luke, who was smiling and watching her. What is wrong with me? She thought. But they think Theodora did it on purpose, made me so mad so I wouldn't be frightened. How shameful to be maneuvered that way. She covered her face and sat down in her chair. No, dear, Theodora said. I am sorry. I must say something, Eleanor told herself. I must show them that I am a good sport. After all, a good sport. Let them think that I am ashamed of myself. I'm sorry, she said. I'm frightened. Of course you were, the doctor said, and Eleanor thought, how simple he is, how transparent. He believes every silly thing he has ever heard. He thinks, even, that Theodora shocked me out of my hysteria. She smiled at him and thought, now I am back in the fold. Here, we can see the dynamic that exists both between Eleanor and the rest of the group, and also the dynamic that exists between Eleanor and Hill House. Eleanor is paranoid, but she's not paranoid about the actual haunted house. No, she's paranoid about people not liking her. What scares Eleanor more than a house that tries to break into your room in the middle of the night? More than a house that sends you spooky chalk messages, and more than a house that produces terrifying hallucinations. What scares her more than any of that is being rejected by the rest of the group. At the beginning of the book, Dr. Montague and his volunteers are all on the same side. It's them versus Hill House. But Eleanor, obsessive, antisocial, angry, and more than a little bit strange, doesn't actually like or admire the rest of the volunteers. It's clear that she cannot stand being in this group, but also it's clear that she cannot stand being outside of the group. So the more that Eleanor thinks everyone is purposefully excluding her, the more that she hates them. But the more that she hates them, the more that the others are going to want to exclude her. It's a vicious cycle that eventually ends with Luke rejecting her romantically, Theodora rejecting her obsessive friendship, and Dr. Montague growing increasingly suspicious about her mental stability. Eleanor has lost her power within the group, and the only path available for her to regain the power that she's lost is to reject humanity completely and join forces with the evil that is Hill House. And there we go. That's Haunted House theme number 3, power, and how that theme plays out in both books. So now we have to decide which book did it better. And I think the winner of round 3 has to be We Have Always Lived in the Castle. I find the power dynamics in this book to be so compelling because at their core, the power dynamics between the villagers and the Blackwoods and between Merricat and Cousin Charles come down to societal forces that are far bigger and stronger than any of the individuals involved in the story. In contrast, the power dynamics portrayed in The Haunting of Hill House are relatively straightforward. I mean, the only real lesson you get out of Eleanor's story is don't be weird and obsessive if you want people to like you. Whereas the dilemmas explored in We Have Always Lived in the Castle don't have easy or straightforward answers. So, round 1 went to The Haunting of Hill House. Round 2 also went to The Haunting of Hill House. Round 3 goes to We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And now, let's move on to the bonus round to round off this debate. Bonus round. Personal opinion. Throughout this debate, I've tried to be objective, or at least I've tried to be objective within the parameters I've set out for myself. But at the end of the day, I am a subjective reader with my own subjective opinions. And for this bonus round, I'm going to acknowledge that by giving my own personal opinion on The Haunting of Hill House versus We Have Always Lived in the Castle. If you asked me which book I personally prefer, I would say We Have Always Lived in the Castle. I love the horror that is embedded in the mundane domestic details. I love the horror of how wildly and chaotically the power dynamics shift throughout the story. I love the horror of this intensely obsessive sibling relationship. And most of all, I love the ambiguity, the horrors that lie just out of sight. We Have Always Lived in the Castle is so perfectly gothic, so perfectly creepy, and so perfectly my subjective ideal of what a haunted house story should be. And so I could give We Have Always Lived in the Castle an extra point and end this debate in a tie and do some kind of cutesy conclusion about how you can't actually decide which book is objectively better. But we all know that would be kind of a disappointing way to end this video, since this is supposed to be a debate video, and since the bonus round exists outside the more objective structure of this debate anyway, I'm not actually going to count it towards the final verdict. I just wanted a chance to voice my own personal opinion on which one is the better book. Part 2, the verdict. So, obviously, the winner of our debate, the definitive Shirley Jackson haunted house book, is The Haunting of Hill House. With its terrifying jump scares, ambiguous dark past, and seductive charm, Hill House is a classic haunted house. And Eleanor, who is arguably as unhinged as Hill House itself, provides depth to and a clever twist on the usual haunted house story. As for which book you will personally enjoy more, that's going to be largely determined by your reading preferences. The Haunting of Hill House is the book for readers who love jump scares, plot twists, and a sentient haunted house that actively participates in the events of the story. If you like fast-paced, plot-heavy horror books, then The Haunting of Hill House is most likely going to be your favorite Shirley Jackson book. We Have Always Lived in the Castle, on the other hand, is perfect for readers who like subtle, atmospheric, and not overtly scary books. If you like slow-paced, character-driven gothic books, then We Have Always Lived in the Castle is most likely going to be your favorite Shirley Jackson book. We are all different readers, we all enjoy different kinds of books, and the wonderful thing about reading is that no matter what kind of reader you are, there's sure to be a book out there for you. Part 3, conclusion. And that wraps up the great Shirley Jackson debate. If you're a Shirley Jackson fan, then I hope that you found new insights into or new ways of thinking about these classic books. And if you've never read a Shirley Jackson book, then I hope you consider adding one or both of these haunted house stories to your spooky season reading plans. And that is going to be everything for this video. This has been the 2 a.m. Book Review Club. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will be back soon with another video. Until then, have a great day and happy book travels.